December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. A glacial, suffocating darkness clung to the ancient pines, a pre-dawn silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. In a frozen foxhole overlooking a shallow valley, Private First Class Thomas Hartley, a 23-year-old scout from the Green Mountains of Vermont, shifted his weight, the crunch of ice under his boots unnaturally loud. 8 months in Europe had taught him the rhythms of war, or so he believed. He was wrong. Across the ink-black expanse, pinpricks of light glowed and faded. Cigarette embers danced like a constellation of orange fireflies along the German lines. Within 72 hours, a mundane habit honed from tracking white-tailed deer through the woods of his home state would propel this quiet private into becoming the most unexpected and valuable intelligence asset in the American sector. The full story of how the careful study of cigarette ash and soldierly habit helped crack the veil of secrecy over one of the largest and most devastating offensives of the war would remain locked in classified files for half a century. What Thomas could not know, as he watched his own breath plume in the sub-zero air, was that his childhood obsession would fuse with a desperate wartime need. His unique method of mapping enemy positions through their smoking rituals would allow him to identify, track, and predict the movements of over 200 German soldiers through terrain deemed impassable. The intelligence he would glean from these tiny, glowing points of light would land on the desks of generals, shape defensive strategies, and ultimately save thousands of Allied lives during the conflict's most perilous hour in Europe. Thomas's education had not come from a military academy, but from the wilderness. He grew up at his father's hunting lodge outside Stowe, Vermont, where the forest was a second language. By 12, he could not only identify the slot of a deer track, but could reconstruct an animal's passage from the subtlest lexicon of the woods. The particular way grass sprang back, the sunken geometry of disturbed pine needles, the telling white interior would reveal by a twig broken at knee height. His father, a taciturn woodsman of Finnish descent, imparted a lesser-known art, how to read a cold campsite. He taught Thomas to examine fire ash, its texture, dispersion, and crystallization pattern, to determine not just if someone had been there, but when, for how long, and even how many. It was a forensic science of the wilderness. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army taught him the official curriculum: reconnaissance, Morse code, map grid coordinates, and radio procedure. These Vermont woodsman skills were filed away as irrelevant curiosities. By the frozen December of 1944, Thomas found himself with the battle-weary 28th Infantry Division, holding a sector of the Ardennes forest that High Command had stamped quiet. Intelligence reports, based on radio intercepts and aerial photos obscured by perpetual cloud cover, insisted the Germans in this region were depleted, defensive. From his forward observation post, OP, a cleverly dug scrape in the earth reinforced with timber and camouflaged under a thicket of holly, Thomas disagreed. His was the evidence of the senses. Through his M3 binoculars, the German positions were a gray smudge 800 meters away. By day, the line was a ghost town. But as night fell and the illusion of concealment took hold, the forest whispered its secrets. Thomas noticed the cigarettes first. The German tobacco had a distinct, acrid odor, a wartime mix of ersatz chemicals and poor-quality leaf that carried further on the cold, still air than the smoother American blend. He could often smell the smoke before seeing the telltale glow. He began to record it. In a standard-issue notebook, he created a grid mirroring his sector map. Each night, he became a cartographer of trivial light. Asterisk 2100 HRS, single ember, grid F7, near ruined farmhouse chimney. 2,230 hours, 2 embers, grid G4, a long stone wall. 0005 HRS, cluster of 3, grid H9, creek bend. Asterisk, it was tedious, seemingly pointless work. After 3 weeks, the emerging pattern was a cold spike of dread. In early December, he logged 30 to 40 nightly events. By the 10th, it was 70. On the night of the 14th, his pencil hurriedly marked over 120 distinct glows in areas previously dark. The quiet, sector was breathing, and its breath was lit with tobacco. He brought his notebook to his platoon sergeant, Mitchell Davies, a grizzled veteran of North Africa and Sicily, with the patience to listen. In their dugout, lit by a single candle stub, the smell of wet wool and burnt coffee between them, Thomas laid out his case. "It's not just the numbers, Sergeant. Look at the placement," he whispered, his finger tracing the map. "They're not just in their defensive holes anymore. They're smoking in the woods, in draws, and forward assembly areas. Places you only be if you're massing to move." Sergeant Davies, his face a roadmap of old wars, studied the meticulous notations. "Brennan?" he asked, referring to their young lieutenant. "Said I was seeing things. Told me to watch for tanks, not smoke breaks." Davies closed the notebook with deliberate care. "Lieutenant Brennan has been shot at for 6 weeks. I've been shot at for 3 years. I'll take this to Captain Morrison." Captain James Morrison, a former enlisted man from Georgia, commanded their company from a command post in the cellar of Shattered Farmhouse. He was a practical man who distrusted comfortable assumptions. When Davies presented Thomas's data, Morrison spent an hour cross-referencing the marked grids with his own operational maps. "Private Hartley," Morrison finally said, his southern drawl low, "you're telling me you could divine enemy intentions from where they choose to have a smoke?" "Sir, I'm saying soldiers are creatures of habit and comfort. They smoke when they feel secure. The pattern of where and when they feel secure reveals their posture. This pattern," Thomas tapped his notebook, "is a pre-attack posture." Morrison's gaze was unflinching. "This contradicts every G2 assessment from here to SHAEF. With respect, sir, the cigarettes don't lie. Either there are twice as many men over there, or the same men have become twice as nervous." A ghost of a smile touched Morrison's lips. "All right, Private. You've got 72 hours. Full observation protocol. Document everything. If you're right, we need to know exactly where the hammer is going to fall. If you're wrong, well, we'll have a very detailed log of nothing." Equipped with new notebooks and joined by Private Edward Chun, a quick-witted radio operator with a photographic memory, Thomas returned to his OP. The night of December 15th was crystalline and bitter. Huddled together for warmth, they documented the glowing landscape. "So we're counting cigarettes," Chin muttered, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "We're tracking behavioral patterns using luminescent markers," Thomas corrected, his eyes glued to his binoculars. "Right, because that's less crazy." By dawn on the 16th, the data was irrefutable. 212 separate smoking events. More critically, Chin's analytical mind saw it. "Tom, over 60% are within 400 meters of our line. In these small valleys and trails, these aren't defensive positions. These are jump-off points." At 0630, the world erupted. A thunderous roar of German artillery shattered the morning, rolling across the front in a wave of fire and sound. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. As shells tore the forest apart around them, Thomas and Chin stayed put. While others fell back in confusion, they became a stationary intelligence hub. Through the chaos, they coolly noted unit insignia on advancing infantry, plotted the paths of assault groups, and identified command clusters. For 6 critical hours, as American lines buckled, they filled their notebooks with the blueprint of the local German attack. Their harrowing return to friendly lines through a hellscape of falling shells led them straight to Captain Morrison. The captain's command post was now a scene of control panic. Without ceremony, Thomas spread his maps and notebooks on a makeshift table. "Sir, elements of the 12th Volksgrenadier and 27th Fusilier Regiments," Thomas reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Main thrust is following these 2 creek beds I'd marked as high-probability avenues. Their support weapons are being set up here and here." Morrison stared, not at the map, but at the private. "You can predict their next moves? Based on their staging areas from the last 2 weeks of smoking data?" "Yes, sir. I believe I can." Within the hour, Thomas was in a jeep, weaving against the tide of retreat, his dirt-smudged notebooks clutched to his chest. He was brought before Colonel Robert Jameson, the division's harried intelligence chief, in a chaotic headquarters buzzing with crisis. Jameson, an Ivy League-educated analyst facing a catastrophic intelligence failure, was desperate for any clarity. He listened to Thomas's explanation of pattern luminescence and habit-based predictive tracking with a mix of skepticism and hope. Private, I have West Point graduates and PhDs who didn't see this coming. You're asking me to believe your hobby has merit. Sir, the proof is advancing toward us right now. The method works. Give me access to all forward observer reports from across the sector for the past month. Let me look for the patterns everyone else filtered out as noise. Skeptical but out of options, Jameson agreed. For 4 days, as the battle raged, Thomas and a reluctantly assigned team pored over hundreds of mundane reports. He taught them what to see, not just campfires sighted, but the pattern of campfires, not just engine heard, but the timing of engines, mentions of increased litter, different cooking smells, the absence of patrols where they should be. It was a symphony of trivialities that, when scored together, revealed the enemy's symphony of attack. On December 20th, Thomas presented a new map to Colonel Jameson and his stunned staff. It predicted 19 primary axes of German advance based on pre-offensive behavioral patterns. When cross-referenced with confirmed enemy movements from the first brutal days, his predictions showed an 85% accuracy rate. From that moment, Thomas Hartley, the Vermont tracker, was quietly placed at the heart of the division's intelligence effort. He trained analysts in his methodology. His cigarette census technique was formalized and disseminated. Commanders began to reposition reserves and artillery based not just on guesswork, but on the predictive maps generated from ash and anxiety. The German offensive, though initially devastating, found American defenses increasingly resilient and responsive in Thomas's sector. Units were waiting where they were supposed to be. Counterattacks struck assembling forces. The element of surprise, once total, was steadily eroded by a new kind of foresight. Thomas Hartley received a battlefield commission and finished the war training others in observational analysis. He returned to Vermont, took over his father's lodge, and spoke of his war experiences only in the vaguest terms. It wasn't until 1993, when military historian Dr. Ellen Martinez unearthed declassified files, that his story emerged. Interviewed in his lodge, an older, quieter Hartley reflected on it all. They called it intelligence work, he said, stirring a mug of coffee. To me, it was just tracking. The forest is the same. The signs are different. A soldier smoking for courage is no different from a buck pausing to test the wind. They both reveal themselves by trying to hide. His obituary in 2008 would call him the scout who tracked an army by its cigarette ash. In military intelligence curricula, case study Hartley endures. It teaches a fundamental, timeless lesson. That victory often hangs on the willingness to see significance in what others dismiss as insignificant, to find the signal in the noise, and to understand that sometimes the most profound secrets are hidden in plain sight, glowing quietly in the dark. If you made it this far, you might also be interested in another incredible, true story of unconventional wartime courage. Check out the video on screen now. And, as always, let us know in the comments, what's the smallest detail you've ever noticed that told a much larger story? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden chapters.